Welcome again to the complete free Flutter course presented by yours truly, Ovidius Mazuro. In this lesson, we're starting the new module, and this module will be a much faster one. And as soon as we're done with this module, we're going to jump straight into actual Flutter code. But there are a few things we need to understand before we jump into Flutter. And specifically, what we're going to focus on in this module is object-oriented programming concepts right here in Dart. I know that a lot of other courses don't teach OOP, or they just expect you to know it, or whatever it is. But knowing OOP, I think, is absolutely essential, especially if you want to get a job doing anything. I guarantee you, if you're applying for some kind of junior position, the employer is going to ask you about object-oriented programming. They'll ask you to define encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, and abstraction. These are the 4 pillars of OOP. And all of that's going to be described in this, I think it's going to be a 4 or 5 lesson module. In this first lesson of the new module, we're going to learn about Dart classes and the first pillar of OOP, which is encapsulation. What is a class? A class, and as you can see, it's a keyword here in Dart, is like a collection of variables and methods which go together. To make that a bit easier to understand, let's show an example. If we had class student, then we can open and close the curly brackets. Then I can put some kind of variables, also methods which describe students. So what would a student have? Well, for example, students might have a GPA, grade point average. A student might also have a university. Of course, university should be a string. And that could be enough for now, actually. And then additionally, students could have some kind of method. And a method is just a function inside of a class. So yeah, it's going to be exactly like a regular function. The only difference is that instead of being inside void main, it's inside a class. So we could have something like void print university. It doesn't take any input and it just prints the university. Not necessarily the most useful function, but it does demonstrate a method. Once we've defined a class, we can use a class the same as any other type, like a double or a string. If I go into void main, I could make a new student of type student and set that equal to student. And then I can say new student dot, and I can use this dot notation to access the variables and the methods on the object. So if I say new student dot GPA equals, and he's a smart student, he'll have 4.0. I could also say new student dot university equals, he's a smart student, Harvard University. So by using this dot notation, I can access the variables, same with the methods, print university. And I can show what that does by just saying dot, I'm in V11, and it prints out Harvard University from here exactly as you'd expect. However, we don't usually access the properties inside a class this way, especially for something like GPA, because there'd be nothing stopping me from saying new student.gpa equals minus 100. And I don't know how your school system is, but in the high school I attended, this wasn't possible. You couldn't get a negative GPA. But there's nothing stopping me from doing it right here. So what I can do instead is inside the class, I can set constraints on certain things. And by not allowing us to use GPA directly, I could instead have a method called a setter. And what a setter is, and it's not the same as the set constraint. So I could have a setter. It's a method which allows us to change a variable inside a class. I could say void set GPA, and I'll take, in fact, it should be a double GPA. And in here, I can say GPA equals GPA. And one more thing I'll do here is this GPA, I'm going to put an underscore on it. The reason I'm putting an underscore on it is that this underscore makes GPA a private variable, and I can also do that with methods if I wanted to. So something is private if it can only be accessed inside the class. So now actually when I try to do new students.gpa, you can see there's a red line on it. Says sets of GPA isn't defined, whatever, leave that as it is. If I put an underscore on it, it really shouldn't be working. Now that I have GPA as a private variable, what I can do is inside the setter, which will now be used to change the value of GPA rather than doing it manually, I can set some kind of constraints. For example, I'll say if GPA less than 0, then I can say print, or in fact I'll throw an exception and I'll say GPA cannot be negative. And if no exception is thrown, then we'll get GPA equals to GPA. So if we do that now, and over here we'll set GPA to -10. Okay, so in this specific instance is working because the underscore is making it private to this file rather than making it private to just the class. So what I'm going to have to do to fix this is make a new folder, a new file I should say, and have main.darts here. And then I'm going to copy my main function right here. And then I can control click here and import, I'm using fit11. There we go. And now that I'm importing it and I'm using it in a separate file, which is how you'll be using this most often, now it doesn't allow me to access this anymore. Now it says, it first says that the setter isn't defined, but it also just doesn't know what GPA is, right? But now that I have the setter, void set GPA, what I can do instead of this, I can say new student dot set GPA, and now I can give him a good score if I want to, and I can print new students dot GPA. I can't print that. The reason I can't print it is because I need the opposite of a setter. So a setter is a method which allows us to change a variable, but just like we need a method to access a private variable, we also need a method called a getter to show a private variable. So what we can do with the getter, nice and simple, is we'll take the return type of our variable, in this case double, and say double get GPA, and we can just use the arrow notation straight away to say this dot GPA. And in fact, we don't even need this. We could just get rid of this and leave it like this. Both of these will work fine. And now here, I can say new students.gpa, but I'm not actually accessing the variable directly. What I'm accessing is this method, this function. And as a result, I can't change it. I can't make some kind of mistake. So just showing what that does. Now when I run it, so it's going to be main.dart. Now that I run it, it sets the GPA, and I actually set it as an int, but Dart is smart enough to convert an int into a double by itself. So it's converted into a double, and then when I say new student.gpa printed, it prints it for me correctly. But the big advantage doing it this way rather than the way I did it before was if I set -4 and try to run it again, I'm going to get unhandled exception, GPA cannot be negative. So that is this exact error that I threw over here. I basically told the program, I told Dart, don't let people do this. If they're doing this, they're using my function wrong, and I'm not happy about that. Another reason I might do this is because it allows me to chain different things. For example, I have double GPA here, but I could also have bool is failing. And one thing I could do is if GPA is less than 0, so I'm throwing the exception already, but I could say if GPA, and I don't know what a failing GPA is, let's say less than 2.0, then we can say is failing equals false, true in fact. And on the other hand, we can say is failing equals false. So now what we're doing is that we're automatically updating the value of is failing based on the GPA that comes in. And I can also have a bool get is failing, and here just return is failing. If I give him a bad GPA, but then say is failing here, then you can see that it gives me the value of is failing automatically. I don't have to set it manually. And the great thing about this is, in this simple class, it might not make a big difference. But if I had something more complicated going on, then this might be really important. Or if I had all kinds of checks or different things, if I wanted to protect the user from their own mistakes, because they could very easily break my code in a way that I don't want them to break it. So getters and setters, they're quite important. Make sure you understand this. So when you see these getters and setters, this is a hallmark or a sign of encapsulation. Encapsulation says we are sending the methods to work on some data, whatever data or variables we have, together with the class. And normally one of the hallmarks of encapsulation is that instead of being able to change the variable directly, we instead use methods to communicate with them. Encapsulation is what makes us need to say string, we have something. Encapsulation is string.length rather than length string. Over here, if I use string.length, the length method has been encapsulated together with the string class, which is why I'm able to use it. On the other hand, if length was just a function which I could call on an object, this is not encapsulated with the object. And by the way, this is how it's done in Python. You might be familiar, except they just use len rather than length. However, all that said, this isn't the way that we normally change variables on a given class. Normally what we do instead is we give a value to the variables as soon as we instantiate the class, and we do that through constructors. And I'm going to get rid of all of this. A constructor lets us easily set values for a new class when we create the class. And a constructor is a method run at the construction of a new class. If I want to use a constructor, I'll start my class the same way I did before, class student, and then I'll put whatever variables I want. For example, double GPA, same as before, bool is failing, and string university. And then I'm going to have a function with no return type with exactly the same name as the class. So the same way I have students with capital S here, I'm going to have students with a capital S here. Then I can take whatever my inputs would be, which would be double, and I'm going to use different names just so it's more obvious what's happening. I'll say double DBL. Then inside I'll say this.gpa. The reason I'm using this here is that's what connects this GPA with this GPA. I'm saying it's not just the new variable inside a function like usual. This is the class's variable GPA. And if anybody does know JavaScript, a real quick notice about this. So the this keyword in Dart is bound to the class itself. JavaScript does a really weird thing where it's bound to whatever instance you're running in, so it can show some strange errors, but Dart doesn't do that. This is bound to the class. Okay, but that aside, so this.gpa equals, like say, double, this dot is failing equals if, and this dot university equals uni. However, this is kind of an awkward way of writing it. Normally, like here I'm using the curly brackets, so it's going to ask me for a double if and uni, and it's really awkward to remember what these kind of things are. So normally what we do is we use exactly the same name as we do here. So I could say double GPA and then set this.gpa equal to GPA. So over here, this.gpa is this one, whereas over here on the other side, GPA is equal to this one that we're passing in. And this is why I used different names the first time, but normally we wouldn't. Normally we just use the same name. It makes things easier. We don't need to think about these things as much. And university here, gonna set that to university. Okay, so if we did want to make a student like this with the constructor, what we can do is say student, new student equals student. And now as soon as we instantiate it, we can pass in the things we want. GPA 2.0 is failing, false, university. This one's going to Yale, why not? We have a lot of very smart students today. But the same way that we shortened all of this into this, we can also shorten this even further, because this is so common to just write the exact same names as what I have here, and then just setting this.gpa equals GPA. You know, we do this all the time, and if I have a long class, this is just one of those things. Who has time to read all that code written by me? So instead, we can shorten this even further if I get rid of this. And now, when doing it this way, I no longer have the option of changing these names. Now, these names have to be exactly the same as this. I can instead say student, as usual, open and close my brackets, and the curlies are optional. Then I can say this.gpa, this dot is failing, and this dot university, and put my semicolon at the end. So what this is going to do is just automatically do all of this for me, because it's just such a common paradigm. And it's going to take the types from over here, so I don't even have to type out double, bool, and string. In fact, if I go over to my main.dart, you'll see I don't have any warnings, anything like that. The constructor is being used exactly the same way as it was being used before. And by the way, if anybody is curious, we can, just like any other function, use positional arguments. That's fine. So I can use this.gpa, this dot is failing, and this.university. This also works. However, you might have noticed that when I tried to do it this way and this way, I had a warning over here. It said over here, the default constructor is already defined. Try giving one of the constructors a name. So this kind of makes sense. Of course, I can't have two different functions with the same name. My compiler is going to get confused. But it says, try giving one of the constructors a name. That's interesting. So it turns out I can also have named constructors. So I could say student.positional. Position. Oh. And by doing it this way, now I can use both these constructors. And what I can do here is student other students equals students. And now I can just dot positional. So I do have to give the name in this case. And give it... This one can go to UCL. So by giving a name to the constructor, now I can call it like this. And if I don't have a name, it's just going to use the default one like this instead. And you might be thinking that why would you do this? But actually can be useful a lot of times. To give a quick example, if I have a list of whatever, perhaps I'll just use a list, new list. Normally we would build it like this. This is the default constructor. The open and close square brackets is just the shorthand syntactic sugar for that default constructor. But list does have some named constructors. Specifically, I could use list of list equals list.filled. And what filled lets me do is have some kind of symbol or whatever I want. Let's put a number. And then I can say how many of them I want, 100, why not? So now if I print the other list, what you're gonna see, so I definitely did it the wrong way around. It's supposed to be how many I want first, and then what I want inside. So now you can see I have 100 ones over here. We're not going to count them, but you have my word, that's going to be 100. This is one way you could commonly use these named constructors. List does it. You could also do it for your own private classes or anything like that. So that was it for today. It's not a terribly complicated lesson or concept. All we went over today was encapsulation and classes, specifically how to make a new class. Normally it's done through constructors. A constructor is a method which has the exact same name as the class name, and inside the constructor we can set different values, different variables. We also went over setters, which allow us to change a variable inside, and also getters, which give us the value of a variable. If anybody wants to access the source code, the link is available in the description below. But that's it for me today. So for myself, Avidius, I am out.